Hello, this is Sondra Oster Baras bringing you a few words of Bible from the heart of Biblical Israel. This week's Torah portion is Re'eh, and we begin in Deuteronomy 11. There's all different kinds of issues that are discussed in this Torah portion, but one of the themes that we see running through this Torah portion has to do with the relationship between the nation of Israel as they come into the land and the nations that surround them. And not only that, the possibility of influence, of negative influences. So I will show you a few examples and see how they connect together. So first of all, one of the other themes, by the way, that runs through this Torah portion is the idea of a temple, or the idea of a central place where God will place his name. And that's something that is repeated a few times in the Torah portion. In Deuteronomy 12, we have a commandment that when they come into the land, they should destroy all the pagan places. Okay, we see in verse 2, destroy all those places where the nations worshipped, which you will now inherit. Destroy their gods. On the hills, on the high hills, and on all the mountains, and around every fresh tree. So we have here this idea that the nations worshipped pagan gods all over the place, in the hills and next to trees and all kinds of stuff. And we have a commandment that they should destroy their altars and all their other places of worship. Okay, and then we have in verse 4, do not do thus, okay, to the Lord your God. What does that mean? What's the context? The context is then clear in the next verse, in verse 5, except at the place that the Lord your God will choose from all your tribes to place his name there. Okay, so basically here we have setting up this contrast. On the one hand, we have a theme that runs throughout the book of Deuteronomy, the danger of pagan worship, and the nation is commanded not to worship these gods. But here we have a slightly different theme. It's not so much what they're worshiping, but where they're worshiping. Where the pagans would worship all over the country, on hilltops and near trees and wherever they wanted. Here, in contrast to that, the Bible is telling us, when you worship God, you need to focus in on one place. There will be one place where God will choose to place his name. And we know that will happen later on, and that will be in Jerusalem. Okay? So that in and itself is interesting because it sets us, the temple is not just a place, technically a place where you bring your sacrifices and you do all this worship. But it's set up here in these few verses as a contrast to a type of worship that the pagan nations did. Instead of all over the place, we have one centralized place for worship. Okay? But I'd like to take this theme of distinguishing ourselves from pagan worship, or separating ourselves from the influences that we will encounter when we come into the land, okay? And we'll see then in chapter 13, we have a number of other examples of things that we are warned about that also have to do with influences, negative influences, but not so much influences from without, not influences that we are subject to because we're coming into a land that is full of pagan worship. But in this case, influences that can come in from within. So if we start in chapter 13, verse 2, we have a situation of someone who claims to be a prophet. Okay? He may have wonders, he may, claim he had a vision or whatever, but what is his message? His message is, yes, I'm a prophet, I have a vision, and I received a word from God. We must go now and worship pagan gods. Now, as soon as you hear that, you're supposed to know, this guy's not a real prophet, because a real prophet is never going to tell us to go worship pagan gods. But here we have the beginning of a problem of somebody who has the power, and in this case maybe he has some supernatural powers, or he is particularly charismatic and he talks about a dream or a vision, okay? But the problem here is that he has a unique ability to influence others. All these people sitting around, they don't have any inclination. They are not considering worshiping. What happens then when someone comes in with an unusual ability to influence and will say, no, 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 let's all go worship a pagan god? Okay? And of course, this person who is trying to pretend he's a prophet, he is punished. Okay? Then we have another situation where we have not a prophet, but just somebody who is your friend, your brother, your family member, and he comes and he whispers to you. He's not standing in the city squares. He's just whispering. He's saying, I think this might be a good idea. Let's go worship, a pagan idol over there. And again, we have the drastic punishment for that person and how terrible it would be if people would listen. And finally, we have perhaps the most drastic situation when we don't have just some individuals that have been influenced by this false prophet or by just somebody, but rather we have an entire city that has been influenced by some leaders who are saying, we're going to go and we are going to worship pagan gods. Now, what do all these examples have in common? And indeed, not just these examples, but the beginning when we talked about distinguishing ourselves from pagan worship. What do they all have in common? There's a recognition here that there's a tremendous danger from environmental influences, shall I say. Okay, you're living in a place, you are not living in a bubble. Whether you can be influenced by the temples and the altars that you see when you come into the land. And let us not forget, when they come into the land, it's not just the altars, there are people there. There are people who are doing bad things, who are worshiping pagan gods. People that we will see as we, if you study Joshua, or certainly in the book of Judges, you see there are many, many nations that were not destroyed and still remain among the nation of Israel and present a tremendous influence, taking the nation away from worshiping the one God of Israel. And so we have here in all these situations, whether you're talking about external influences, other nations that can influence the nation of Israel, or within the nation of Israel, individuals that for whatever reason are going in the wrong way, but put themselves in a position of enormous power and influence. The danger of this kind of situation. And I think the message here, more than any other message, is that each and every individual is responsible to understand what it is that God expects from us. If we read the Bible, if we read Deuteronomy, if we stay loyal to what God expects from us, we should be able to distinguish the nasty influences. We should be able to, not without putting ourselves in a bubble, okay, we should be able to see these influences and know enough to separate ourselves from them and not follow in their ways. It is a very important lesson for all of us today as for all time. Have a wonderful weekend. Shabbat Shalom.
I hope you enjoyed that video, and we'd like to be sure you're getting all of our video content. So just click on the subscribe button below, as well as on the notification bell, and that way you will have easy access to all our material. We look forward to staying in touch with you. God bless you, and have a wonderful day.